But welcome to the first Fabian session of the year. It's a big year this year, being election year, and we thought we should think very carefully about our program this year when we were planning and look at positive, strong policies and issues building up to the election whenever it may take place later in the year. So it seemed a very good place to start, building a better future. Craig Renney's an economist, Diana Russell's a policy analyst, both working with the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, and there's copies of their documents circulating. And I'm going to hand it over straight to Craig. And Craig, tell us what you're doing and where you are and introduce the session. Thanks.
New Zealand's got one of the lowest average hourly earnings amongst our peers. What does that mean in the real world? It means that wages at the bottom are compressed. And for more and more New Zealanders, their wage increases are not coming from changes from their employer, but are actually coming from changes from the government. And so the returns to education, the returns to investment for those on very low income groups is declining. And they're not seeing the benefits of that in ways which will be obvious overseas. There's an undeniable housing crisis right now in New Zealand, and a big part of that is that no single agency is responsible for our infrastructure challenges. No single agency is responsible for tackling climate change. Last time I checked, there were 16 different ministers who had responsibility for climate change. As a consequence, that means no one has responsibility. Similarly, we have a minister for infrastructure, a minister for housing, a minister for transport, a minister for education, a minister for health, and a minister for a wide range of areas, social development, and they're all responsible for their small part of their infrastructure system, but no one's responsible for bringing it all together. And so that, for us, is a real failure of the New Zealand government, where you've got such a large infrastructure gap. How do you tackle that problem? And so what we've learned over the past 30 years is that growth built upon ever higher levels of consumption rather than investment has simply led to environmental decay, an indifference towards inequality, and the prioritization of our short-term needs over the long term. And there's nothing more short-term, I would argue, right now, than the prioritization of potential tax cuts over investment in the public realm and investment in public infrastructure. But all of these things are a choice. All of these things are a thing that we can choose to do or not choose to do. We can tackle these concerns and realize the opportunities that are available to us if we act in a coordinated economic strategy where everyone can contribute, where we deliberately make the choice to tackle those inequalities and to make sure that we leave no one behind. So for us, I can give you a list of luminaries who will tell you, everyone from the Prime Minister to Mariana Mazzucato. I can give you Joseph Stiglitz, I can give you the UN, and I can't tell you if he's in the room, but Max Rashbrook, who will also agree in Wellington, that it's time for change. The important thing is, what kind of change do we want to see delivered in New Zealand? And for us, that's really very much about delivering what kind of vision do we want to see for the economy in the future. Getting that clear vision, getting that real sense of what good looks like for the economy is for us at the heart of the biggest problem that we have in economic policy in New Zealand right now, which is that it's not clear what good looks like in the economy. We can talk about a well-being economy, we can talk about well-being budgeting, we can talk about differences in economic ideology, but there's no clear sense of what a good economy looks like, nor how we're going to get there. So we have 3 questions that we ask of every audience that we go to around the country. And the first of which is, we've articulated that vision, we've articulated a statement about that vision. And so do you agree with that statement? Do you think it's missing? Do you think something should be changed? And we'll be delighted to hear that. We've then articulated 5 missions that we think are the architecture that give shape to that mission, that allow it to exist. Do you agree with those missions? Do you think there's something missing, or do you think something should be done differently. And then we've got 5 sample policies that give life to those missions. They help to articulate what kinds of outcomes we're wanting to seek in those missions. And again, we're really keen to hear from you if you agree, if you disagree, or if you think there's something missing in that space. So if we could pick one last time for me, and I'll talk to you about what our vision is for that new economy, and then I'll hand over to Diana, who's in the room, and hopefully you'll be able to hear a lot easier than trying to hear from me down the Zoom line. So the CTU, you'll be unsurprised to hear that we believe that by working together, we can build that better economy for New Zealand. We know the outlines of the economy that we want. We talked about it before. We want an economy that's more productive, more sustainable, and more inclusive. Now, to us, one of the best indicators that many people use is that for the World Bank consistently rates New Zealand as the best country in the world to be in business. We have, it's fantastically easy to set up a company in New Zealand. We have a transparent and relatively uncorrupt public service. We have access to financial services. We have access to labour. We are consistent. It's either New Zealand or Singapore is always number 1 and number 2, about which is the best country in the world to be a business. And if it wasn't for the fact that we're regularly 45th in the world in order to be able to get an electrical connection to your factory, we will be light years ahead of Singapore. Now that's great, but for us, we want to create an economy in which this is also the best country in the world to be a worker. Because we can't just be the best country in the world to be in business, we also need to be the best country in the world to be a worker. The Prime Minister talks about New Zealand being the best country in the world to be a child. We don't think it's possible for New Zealand to be the best country in the world to be a child unless we're also the best country in the world to be a worker. And those things go together. They're not separate. We can't just concentrate on one over the other. We're already light years ahead on how we deliver for businesses. We should spend a little bit of time trying to redress that balance and say, how do we become the best country in the world also to be a worker, so that we can be the best country in the world to be in a family, and the best country in the world to be a child. And so for us, for the CTU, that means a country that delivers that high wage, high skill economy, that delivers decent work, not just work, but decent work that has a future and career and prospects. One that addresses an economy that addresses our income and wealth inequalities and incentivizes the green, carbon neutral investment in industry that we need, that delivers the just transition that we need for New Zealand. One that provides housing as an accessible, affordable human right first, not just simply a means of investment. We need to move away from an economy where we consider our housing a form of a cash machine to being a means of shelter, to being a means where people can live, and a means where we can genuinely build cohesive communities, rather than just building investment portfolios for the lucky few who can increasingly afford that property. And importantly, we need an economic strategy that supports communities to work together to solve problems, rather than creating division or attempting to put workers against others, or attempting to put some groups against others. An economic strategy should be a means by which we can all get together and tackle the challenges that are in front of us, and use all of the contributions of the communities that are in front of us, rather than trying to drive us apart. So I'll hand over to Diana now, who's going to talk about the missions for the approach.
So our 5 missions are economic equity, adequate housing and infrastructure needs for the 21st century, a just transition towards climate mitigation and resilience, decent work and a greater work-life balance, and enabling the enduring well-being of New Zealanders. So our first mission is economic equity, and that looks at social investment and taxation. For that, we're proposing a national investment bank to encourage social investment. Other countries around the world who do this better have a national investment bank that allows for the creation of their nation's necessary finance and infrastructure needs. The Scottish National Investment Bank is a good example of a model that we could adopt here. It takes patient capital approach and makes investments in things that the government wants to invest in but can't, or where it can de-risk investments for others. One example of that is kitchens in schools. We know it has positive spillover benefits for kids, and alongside that you can create civil defence centres around the country, but it's not something the government would ordinarily invest in. So we're proposing to pay for the National Investment Bank via a levy on the profits of the big Australian banks. Over the past 10 years and during COVID, the New Zealand government has systematically de-risked their investments, and so we think they should pay something back on the other side. We're also, alongside that, recommending the creation of a new state Crown-owned default KiwiSaver. There's currently 380,000 people in default KiwiSaver schemes, and for the banks those are just dead money. Instead we can invest in that ourselves and create a pool of capital to help with our nation building needs. Our second mission is around delivering our infrastructure needs for the 21st century, and so we're proposing for that a Ministry of Green Works to increase our capacity to build. It will be responsible for construction, urban design, architecture alongside planning, policy and strategy. This is based in part on the work of First Union. Currently, no government department has the in-house expertise or capacity or mandate to implement our infrastructure needs. Government policy is more often than not merely direction setting, with the idea that the private sector will step in and construct. So the Ministry of Green Works would bring specialised on-the-ground expertise and capacity back in-house. It would look forward 15 years into the future and construct where the private sector is not. So this would help smooth the boom-bust cycles of the construction sector, giving builders and construction sector certainty so that they can invest, train staff and plan. For the old Ministry of Works was also a training pipeline and one of the biggest providers of skills and trades training in the country. For the CTU, housing is a human right. It's not just a means of creating more capital. So it's time we looked at alternatives. Our third mission, we believe no economic strategy would be complete without a just transition towards climate mitigation and resilience. So this includes a goal to shift heavy transport away from fossil fuels and into green electricity or green hydrogen. Energy security and resilience is a big part of this mission. We know our electricity demand is growing. According to the Climate Change Commission, our demand for electricity will increase by 45% by 2025. The cost of not delivering our climate change commitments is huge. This is money that would therefore not be being invested elsewhere, like housing, infrastructure, hospitals, schools and transport. If our climate change goals are not met, it will cost us 10.4% of GDP. But if we do meet those Paris commitments and our net zero climate change goals, that would reduce to 3.7%. So anything we do in this area, we believe must be done as part of a just transition alongside in partnership with Māori as Treaty of Waitangi partners, and it must ensure that the workers and communities directly affected by a transition do not unfairly shoulder the burden. Luckily, we know that green investments create more jobs per dollar invested than their carbon heavy counterparts. They require more urban planners, more engineers, more construction workers. For example, mass transport creates 1.4 times more jobs than roads per dollar invested. So transitioning from fossil fuels to green energy is therefore a win-win for all. As part of our fourth mission, the CTU wants a new Decent Work Act to replace the Employment Relations Act. Our call for decent work can be broken down into three main compartments. That's increasing the bargaining power of workers and recognition of unions, good work and better work-life balance, and addressing the gender pay gaps. As part of this, we want to pilot a 4-day or 32-hour work week where possible. We know this won't work for everyone, but we do know that the benefits accrue to greater increased productivity, and we want to see labour better valued in New Zealand. New Zealanders work some of the longest hours in the developed world. When labour is cheap, employers just use more labour when they could be investing elsewhere for their productivity gains. As a part of our Decent Work Act, we also want to see free public ECE for all children progressively provided over time, and we want to decouple parental leave and do this via the income insurance scheme. These two policies, combined ECE and increasing paid parental leave, would help reduce the gender pay gap by roughly 80% and provide children the best start by getting them in front of professionals early on, and this would also, alongside the gender pay gap, provide a wraparound service for vulnerable parents and children. We know that in countries like Finland and Germany that have more equitable gender pay, parental leave schemes, that fathers take 45% of that leave, which helps break down the gender stereotypes that contribute to those pay gaps. It's been 50 years since the Equal Pay Act, and yet the pay gap is still not closed, and it's much worse for Māori and Pacifica. At the current rates of reduction, it would take 120 years to reduce the Pacifica pay gap. So additionally, we want to deliver pay transparency and opt out unionism, because those workforces have much lower pay gaps. And we'd recommend changes to employment law around contracting to bring it in line with the Topate Working Group on better protections for contractors. There's a lot we can do in this decent work, but it needs a new act, because otherwise it's going to be operating under the old framework, and that old framework disincentivises working people. So our fifth mission is enabling the enduring wellbeing of New Zealanders by working with central government, economic agencies to embed and build a genuine wellbeing approach to economic development. So an example of this that illustrates this better is Dunedin Hospital. We can tell you every day over the next 10 years what it costs to build Dunedin Hospital, every piece of steel, concrete, land and labour, etc. What we can't tell you is the cost of not building Dunedin Hospital over the last 20 years in terms of lost lives, workforce training and lost economic output, because we don't measure it. We can't tell you what the liability of not building is, because we only concentrate on the debt and the spend. We say that these are things that we can measure from an accounting perspective, and therefore that's what we concentrate on, but we don't measure the other side of the conversation. And because of that, we say debt must be below 20% of GDP. But if debt is below 20% of GDP and your infrastructure gap is 2/3 of GDP, all you've got is low debt and a high liability. So if you had higher debt and lower liability, people would be better off, and you wouldn't be passing that liability on to future generations. So we want to change that by suggesting that the Treasury, the Reserve Bank and central government change the way they measure and do those things, and genuinely put wellbeing at the centre and the heart of economic development and of what we do. And that brings us to the end.
Just before you go, can you go back and say that very slowly, that last bit? That one there when you talked about liability, and you had it going one way and then you reversed it round. What's the second last sentence?
If you had higher debt and lower liability, people would be better off, and you wouldn't be passing that liability on to future generations.
It's a suggestion really on that last mission statement, enabling, could you read it out?
The enduring wellbeing of New Zealanders?
Yeah, could we add all before New Zealanders?
Yeah, sure.
You talked about the $210 billion deficit in infrastructure upgrade. What's the proposal to invest in that infrastructure?
We have some fairly arbitrary rules around the level of debt that we have in New Zealand. New Zealand doesn't have a debt crisis, but it behaves like it does. It behaves like there's permanently a debt crisis just around the corner. Our net core current debt levels are due to fall well below 20% by the end of the forecast period. Net core current debt in the UK is around 100% of GDP. In the US, it's around 125% of GDP. In Japan, it's around 270% of GDP. We have chosen to keep the debt level where it is, rather than using some of that investment to improve both the productivity of our construction sector, so we can build things better and more quickly and more effectively ourselves in New Zealand. We've also chosen to make sustained lower investments in the public realm. And as a consequence, we should be using the resources that are actually in the economy, the resources that are actually here and are open to us. I remember approximately 5 years ago talking to Standard & Poor's when they came in to see the Minister of Finance. And one of the things they referred to New Zealand debt was, they said it was like Hermes bags, because they were actually extremely desirable. There were very few of them, and people liked to show them off because they were so vanishingly rare. The market is not awash with New Zealand debt. The market will quite happily take more debt. The thing is, actually, rather than worrying about the debt position or worrying about how we pay for it, the question is, how do we actually deliver the infrastructure gap closing? And that, to me, is the really important story, because it's in delivering that infrastructure gap closing through a Ministry of Works, through a national investment bank, that we can do that sustainably. It's not the money is not the problem. The problem is actually the delivery, which is the real issue. Diana, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Just that the National Investment Bank, we're also going to be paying for in part via a levy on the big four banks, as well as the new default KiwiSaver and the investments that can be made through that.
Kia ora, Craig. I saw when we were travelling around the South Island that we do seem to be swapping dairy cows for pine trees. And while that might kind of look quite good in theory, and that maybe we've got way too many cows, I'm not really sure that replacing large numbers of cows with large numbers of pine trees is really, really good economic decision making or well-being decision making.
Thank you. I agree with you. I think we had too much dairy because we allowed too many conversions on the Canterbury Plain. What we ended up with were highly polluted rivers and a lot of milk. Now, that's great, but we're again prioritizing our short-term needs over our long-term needs. Similarly, when we plant a lot of Pinus radiata everywhere because we can now get carbon credits for it, that's great. But we're simply prioritizing our short-term needs over our long-term needs. How do we instead of becoming a bulk commodity exporter, move up the value chain of those products, become an exporter of the kinds of nutracycles and advanced products that we know have a market and continue to have a market, not only now but over the next 10 years? How do we make sure that we're getting ahead in sectors where we currently don't have growth, or in sectors where we currently don't have any huge amounts of strength? Advanced manufacturing and the links into food manufacture is one of them in New Zealand. So to me, the question that you've raised is a really interesting and important one, because it highlights we've got another gold rush right now in terms of trees in rural locations, which is great, but it's not a long-term solution. And instead of continuously focusing on that short-term need, we need to be asking the question, what's our economic strategy? What's our economic goals? And how is our economic development delivering those goals and that strategy, rather than just chasing the short-term dollar that exists?
Do you have a place? Do you have a place in your missions for the discussion and preparation of a population policy? There are two aspects of that I was thinking about. One is that with climate change and sea level rise, there's a very strong possibility that the world will see many climate change refugees, and New Zealand may well be a very favoured destination. And another aspect is that greater population means loss of agriculturally productive land. So New Zealand has never had a proper population policy, and I wonder whether you are considering that somewhere.
At this point, I'm tempted to hand over to Diana, but I'll attempt to answer the question first, and then we'll go from there. In terms of whether or not we should have a population strategy, I think the question that you raised is a really important one. We should be asking ourselves the question, how do we deliver for not only the population we have now, the population that we know we're going to have over the next 25 years? And one of the things the Infrastructure Commission's report does is it highlights that lack of that pipeline and that lack of that delivery of infrastructure over the next 10, 20, 30 years. If we look at whether or not we want to deliver on a population strategy, i.e., do we want to seek to have a population of 5 million, 10 million, 15 million? I'm a bit less sold on the value of trying to make it a specific number or keep it within a specific realm. But I certainly do agree with you that the loss of elite soils, the loss of high quality agricultural soils, particularly around Auckland, is a really big problem for a country like New Zealand and for our ability to continue to feed ourselves. But again, it also speaks to the kind of lack of planning, of urban planning, of density of planning in New Zealand, and the continuing desire to move out and go out of our cities and grow more urban land out of our cities, rather than asking ourselves the question, how do we deliver growth inside our existing cities? How do we make sure there's growth and there's economic opportunities where people are, and that people and economic opportunities can grow together, rather than just seeking to build continuously new amounts of land around Drury, around elsewhere in Auckland, in some other areas around Christchurch, and instead build the kinds of housing that we actually need to see in New Zealand, which is increasingly urban, increasingly smaller, and increasingly dense, rather than building the kinds of buildings that builders want to build, which is flat land on big sections with 5-bedroom houses, because that's where the profit margin is.
Laura Thomas, I just wanted to say that the concept of a 4-day week, I think, is a good one. A lot of the workers that I have direct contact with would want to know about the other side of that, so obviously on the same income, because that's why a lot of the lower paid workers are actually working so many hours as just to, cover the debts and stuff. So I think it's a great idea. It is about, when we're talking to workers about this, is how that gets understood as not being everyone taking a cut, but somehow redistributing so that people can afford to do a 4-day week.
Thank you, Dorothy, for the question. One of the things that we do incredibly badly in New Zealand is we undervalue labour. We undervalue work. We work very long hours in New Zealand, as we said earlier, much longer than is found elsewhere, but we get less out of that work. One of the things a 4-day work week does is it's got benefits for workers in terms of they get some time back, but it also has benefits for firms, because where it's been trialled overseas, they see quite significant productivity increases on the back of that move to that 4-day week. Now, it won't work for everyone. If you're making coffees, and you can only make so many coffees in 32 hours as you can in 40. And so it won't work for everyone, but we think it will work more often than you think, and in more sectors than you think. And so one of the big pieces of research that's just come out of the US is that there's 3,300 businesses that have been involved in a trial of the 4-day work week in the US, and 86% of the businesses involved in the trial are going to continue the 4-day work week going forward, because they can see real tangible benefits for them and for their workers. One of the biggest challenges we know that New Zealand employers have right now is in retaining talent, in getting new talent, in retaining skills in workplaces. And unsurprisingly, those workplaces that have moved to a 4-day work week have retained their skills better, have retained their people better, and find it easier to attract new people. So there's a real win on the other side. Now, the model that's been adopted internationally for this, and the 4-day work week, people who do this elsewhere, is what we call the 100-80-100 model. So you get 100% of the pay for 80% of the time for 100% of the output. So this is not about trying to reduce someone's pay by 20%. It's about trying to use people's time more effectively, trying to make sure that you're becoming more productive as a firm, giving the worker something back and giving them time. And for too many of our workers right now, one thing they lack right now is time. And it's time with their families, time with the people that they want to be, time to do something other than work. And that's where we think a 4-day work week can have a real benefit, which is why we're calling for a trial, a large-scale trial in a sector or in an area where we can see what are the pros and cons, how does it work, and how can we then make that work across the rest of the economy where it's relevant and where it might work.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Craig and Diana. Is there anything you'd like to say just in summing up? Craig, I realise it's after midnight for you, but have you got something you'd like to just wrap up with?
Sure. I'd like to thank Diana, who's in the chair next to me there, who's heard me give this speech approximately 37 times, and I probably need a medal the size of a dishpan for hearing it for the 38th. So thank you, Diana. I'd like to thank the CTU for helping in sponsoring us and looking after us in helping to pull this together. The one thing I would say is that this is very much the start of a conversation. We think there's a need to be having an ongoing conversation in New Zealand about what kind of economy we want to deliver. We're going to produce the successor to this report in May this year. But again, that's not the end of the conversation. We need to be continuously having the conversation, advocating for a more progressive approach to our economic development, for a more progressive approach to how we view the economy and the investments and the liabilities that we have. And that's a conversation we're really keen to have with you and to keep having with you, not just as we get to the final report, but as we head to the election and beyond. Because one of the things we're acutely aware of is that there are lots of organisations who want to have the conversation about why we should just revert back to the way things were in the past, why we should just ease the path of business, why we should reduce regulation, why we should simply just get government to step out of the way. One of the things that we don't have in New Zealand is a consistent platform, a consistent place in which we're repeatedly and articulately talking about what a progressive vision for the economy looks like. And that's something we're really keen to have with you in the Fabians and also all the organisations out there, because we want to build that story of what a good economy looks like, so then we can then start to build the policies to deliver upon it.
Do you want to say anything?
No, thank you so much for having us. It was great chatting with you.
Hey, that's a brilliant start for the year. It's a great launchpad for us at the Fabian. So could you join me in thanking both Craig and Diana? Thanks very much.